My father never said,
But
"I
beneath the
love
floor
you."
of his workshop
Not
waited a
once.
hidden key,
Not on
a
birthdays.
secret room,
Not in
and
the
a truth
hospital when the
buried for no.
morphine had loosened everything else. He was a mechanic who fixed other people's broken things and a carpenter who built furniture he usually just gave away. He communicated in actions: a repaired bicycle left by my door, a bowl of soup on the counter when I was sick, the lights always on when I came home late. When he died, he left me a house I was about to lose, a debt I couldn't explain, and 16 days to figure out what to do about both. I thought the hardest thing would be packing up his workshop. I was wrong. The hardest thing was finding out that the quiet man who raised me, the man who alphabetized his wrenches and never once raised his voice, had spent 30 years carrying a secret so heavy it had slowly crushed him from the inside out. He didn't leave me a letter. He left me a key, rusted, cold, old iron with a toothed bit that didn't match anything in the house, or so I thought. And beneath the concrete floor of his garage, behind a machine I'd walked past 1,000 times, was a door. And behind that door was the truth about who my father really was, and the war he had been quietly preparing for me to finish. My name is Nora Callahan. I was 18 years old, and this is what I found. My father never said, "I love you." Not once. Not on birthdays. Not in the hospital when the morphine had loosened everything else about him. His grip on the bed rail, his careful posture, the controlled expression he'd worn his entire life, like a second skin. Not even at the end, when I sat beside him in that narrow room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet defeat, holding his hand while the machines kept their steady, indifferent count. He was a man who communicated in actions. A repaired bicycle left outside my bedroom door on a Tuesday morning with no explanation. A bowl of soup on the kitchen counter when I came home sick from school, still warm, the bowl wiped clean on the outside the way he always did. The porch light always on, no matter how late I came home. The check engine light on my ancient Honda that somehow fixed itself overnight without anyone ever mentioning it. That was Jim Callahan's language. The language of done things, quiet things, things that required no acknowledgement and expected no thanks. When he died on the 14th of February, and yes, the cruelty of that date was not lost on me, he left behind a workshop full of half-finished projects, a house with a mortgage I couldn't locate in any file, and a silence so complete it had texture. You could press your hand against it and feel it push back. He was 59 years old. He should have had more time. We both should have. The cancer had started in his pancreas 18 months before the end. He told me on a Wednesday evening in August, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between us, in the same tone he used to tell me the truck needed new tires. Matter of fact, no drama. Just information being transferred from one person to another. I cried. He didn't. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine for exactly 3 seconds. Then he picked up his coffee cup and asked if I'd eaten dinner. That was Jim Callahan. I was 18 years old and 3 weeks into being an orphan when Gareth Howell called. Gareth was 72, a retired attorney who had handled our family's modest legal affairs for as long as I could remember. He had a voice like old leather, worn smooth, slightly cracked at the edges, but still holding its shape. I had always liked him. He was one of those men who listened more than he spoke, which meant that when he did speak, you paid attention. He called on a Thursday morning while I was standing in the kitchen eating cereal straight from the box because I hadn't been to the grocery store in 11 days. "Nora," he said without preamble, "I need to tell you something about the house." I set the cereal box down. "There's a lien on the property," he said, "a mortgage instrument held by a company called Northgate Holdings. The balance is substantial. I'm looking at the paperwork right now, and I have to be honest with you. I don't fully understand where this came from. Your father never mentioned it to me." I asked him what substantial meant. He told me the number. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically. My legs simply stopped cooperating. "How long do I have?" I asked. 16 days before proceedings begin," he said. "I'm sorry, Nora. I wish I had better news." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat on the kitchen floor of the house my father had lived in for 22 years and looked at the water stain on the ceiling above the refrigerator, the one he'd been meaning to fix for 3 summers in a row. And I thought about how much I did not understand about the man who had raised me. 16 days. The number sat in my chest like a stone. I decided to start in the workshop. Not because I thought I'd find anything useful there. I started there because it was the room that felt most like him, and I was still at the stage of grief where proximity to his things felt like a form of company. The workshop occupied the back half of the detached garage, a large, low-ceilinged space that smelled permanently of machine oil sawdust and the particular cold that seeps into concrete and never fully leaves. Jim had built his workbench himself from a single slab of maple he'd hauled back from a salvage yard in Akron. It was 8 feet long and 4 inches thick and weighed more than some cars. The surface was scarred with the record of 30 years of work burn marks, saw grooves rings from coffee cups, the ghost of every project he'd ever brought to that surface. It was in its way a map of his life. The tools were organized with a precision that had always seemed slightly excessive to me as a child, and now seeing it through adult eyes, read as something closer to need. Every wrench on the pegboard hung in descending order of size, left to right. Every socket in its labeled drawer. Every clamp in its designated clip. His hand planes were arranged like books on a shelf heel to toe blades wrapped in oiled cloth. A place for everything and everything in its place. He said it so often it had become wallpaper. Background sound. One of those phrases you stop hearing because it has been present for as long as you can remember. Standing in that workshop alone for the first time, I finally heard it. Not as a preference, as a philosophy. as the way a man who felt he had very little control over certain things in his life chose to impose order on the things he could control. I stood there for a long time, in the particular silence that comes after someone has left a room they will never return to. And I understood something about my father I had never understood while he was alive. He wasn't just tidy, he was afraid. I started on the main workbench, working slowly, wrapping the smaller tools in newspaper and laying them into boxes. The hand planes, the marking gauges, a spoke shave he'd used to shape chair legs, its blade ground to a fine curve from decades of use. Each object had the particular weight of something long handled the surface worn smooth and dark from the oil of his hands. I kept stopping. That was the problem. I'd pick something up and I'd be somewhere else for a moment, watching him at this bench, the angle of his head, the way he squinted when he was measuring the low, unconscious hum he made when he was concentrating. Then I'd come back to the empty room and the silence and the 16 days hanging over the house like weather. I was working on the lower shelves when I found the photograph. It was tucked between two old hardbound manuals, one on automotive electrical systems, one on furniture, joinery, spine to spine. The photograph pressed flat between them, as if placed there deliberately. I almost missed it. My hand caught the edge as I pulled the books apart, and the photograph slid out and fell face up onto the workbench. I picked it up, black and white, old stock, the edges softened with age and handling. 4 men standing in front of a large panel van on what appeared to be a rural road, gravel under their feet, bare trees in the background. Late autumn or early winter, judging by the coats. The van had no markings I could make out. 3 of the men were strangers, one heavy-set, one tall and lean, one shorter, with his hands in his pockets. The 4th man, standing at the left edge of the frame with his arms crossed and a look of careful assessment on his face, was my father. He was young, 24, 25 at most. He looked the same jaw, same set to his shoulders, same way of standing. That suggested he was ready to leave before he'd arrived, but stripped of the decades that had settled into the face I knew. Younger and harder, and something else. Something I didn't have a word for immediately. Alive was what came to me. He looked intensely, dangerously alive. I turned the photograph over, written in pencil and handwriting I did not recognize, not my father's careful block print, but someone else's looser, faster hand. The last good night, 1991. I stood at the workbench for a long time with that photograph in my hand. 1991. My father would have been 25 years old, 14 years before I was born. I had always understood, in the vague way children understand things about their parents' lives before them, that Jim Callahan had existed as a full person in a world that preceded me. But knowing it abstractly and holding photographic evidence of it were 2 different things. I had never seen this photograph before. I had gone through the entire house, every drawer, every box, every shelf in the weeks after his death, the way you do when someone leaves and you're trying to hold on to whatever traces of them remain. There were photographs. Not many. Jim was not a sentimental man in that way, but some. Their subjects were consistent. My mother at various ages, me at various ages, a few of Jim and his brother at some indeterminate family gathering. Not one of them showed anyone I didn't recognize. Not one of them showed my father standing in front of an unmarked van on a gravel road. Who were those three men? What was the last good night? I set the photograph on the workbench and turned back to the shelves. I worked for another hour, methodically trying to keep my mind on the task. But the photograph sat in my peripheral vision the whole time, and the questions it raised sat in the back of my mind with the patient certainty of things that are not going to leave until they are answered. It was late afternoon when I pulled out the big red toolbox. It was Jim's primary tool chest, a heavy cantilever case he'd owned since before I was born. The red paint long since gone to rust at the corners, the surface patterned with the accumulated splatter of 30 years of work. It took 2 hands to move. I set it on the floor, opened the clasps, they shrieked in the cold air, and let the top trays unfold on their hinges. Everything exactly where it belonged. Of course, I lifted out the top tray, then the second. I was looking at the third when my hand paused. The bottom of the box was lined with a thin piece of foam, oil-stained, cut to fit unremarkable. I had seen it 100 times growing up the way you see something so often it becomes invisible. But now I was looking at it differently. Looking at everything differently. I touched the foam, pressed it. It moved. Not foam that shifts when you press it. Foam that shifts in a way that suggests something beneath it that does not. I worked my fingers along the edges. There was a seam, clean, deliberate, running around the perimeter about an inch from the wall of the box. Not damage. Design. I lifted the edge, and the foam came up in one piece, revealing what it had been covering. Not the painted metal bottom of the toolbox. A false bottom. A thin sheet of metal fitted perfectly with a small folded tab at one end. I pulled the tab and the plate lifted out. In the shallow space beneath it, nestled in a fitted cutout of dense foam, were 2 objects. The first was a key. Not a modern key. Not the kind of thing you'd have cut at a hardware store. This was old iron dark, with age pitted along its surface, with the particular texture of metal that has been resting undisturbed for a very long time. It had a solid round bow and a complex bit, not a simple slit, but a layered toothed profile that suggested a lock of uncommon specificity. The second was a folded piece of paper. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Jim's block print, careful and precise, the letters formed with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. It said, garage, corner. Forgive me, that was all. I picked up the key. It was cold. Much colder than the air in the workshop, which didn't make sense, but I noticed it anyway. I closed my fingers around it and stood there in the failing light of the late afternoon, holding a key that didn't belong to anything I had ever seen in this house, and a photograph of a man I almost didn't recognize, and a note that my dead father had apparently left for me to find. Forgive me for what I spent the next 2 hours looking for the lock. I tried the key on the old steamer trunk in the spare bedroom, the one that had come from my grandmother's house, and which my father had never opened in my presence, saying only that it contained things he wasn't ready to look at. The lock was brass and old, but the keyhole was a simple slit. My iron key wouldn't enter it. I tried the locked filing cabinet in the corner of the living room, a heavy 2-drawer unit I had always assumed held financial records and tax documents. The lock was a small standard-issue tumbler. Wrong. I tried the cast-iron clean-out door of the old fireplace. Wrong. I went outside in the cold and tried both padlocks on the storage shed at the edge of the property. Wrong and wrong. I came back inside and sat on the bottom step of the stairs and held the key and thought about what Jim had written. Garage. Corner. I'd been in the workshop for most of the day, and I had searched every shelf, every cabinet, every visible surface. There was no lock in that room that would accommodate this key. I had been thorough. I was always thorough. It was one of the few traits I had clearly inherited from my father. But he had written garage and corner. I put on my jacket and went back out. The garage was a 2-car space, though Jim had never used it for cars. The front half was storage seasonal equipment, gardening tools, a lawnmower, the accumulated overflow of a long-occupied house. The back half was the workshop. In the far back corner, behind the table, saw a cast-iron cabinet, saw that weighed somewhere north of 400 pounds, and had sat in that position for as long as I could remember. There was a section of floor I had never had occasion to look at closely. I pushed the saw. It did not want to move. I found the lever Jim kept for moving heavy equipment, a steel pry bar mounted on the wall behind the saw, and I used it as a wedge, rocking the saw on its base plates, working it inch by inch away from the corner. My arms burned. The saw's iron wheels left dark grooves in the concrete as they moved. The whole process took 20 minutes, and I was sweating, despite the cold, by the time I had moved the machine far enough to see the floor behind it. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath. Then I looked down, cut into the concrete floor so precisely that the lines had filled with decades of dust and grime until they were nearly invisible, a perfect square approximately 3 feet by 3 feet. In the center of the square, lying flush with the surface, was a small iron ring, a pull ring, the kind set into a door, flush with its surface so it doesn't protrude. I had walked past this spot hundreds of times. I got down on my knees on the cold concrete. The ring was stiff, corroded at its pivot point, reluctant. I worked it with my fingers back and forth until it moved freely enough to grip. Then I hooked my fingers through it, planted my feet, and pulled. The first attempt accomplished nothing. The door was sealed with years of grime and pressure, its weight distributed over a frame designed to sit tight. I repositioned, gripped harder, and pulled again with everything I had. legs driving back straight, the kind of effort that makes the world go briefly white at the edges. With a sound like tearing, a grating, grinding shriek of metal separating from stone, the door lifted. A wave of air came up from below. It was cold, deeply, profoundly cold, the way stone is cold when it has been sealed away from sunlight for years. And the smell was the smell of time itself, damp earth and old stone, and the complete absence of anything recent. It hit me in the face, and I rocked back on my heels for a moment. Below was darkness, and from the darkness came the top of a wooden ladder, its rungs worn smooth in the middle from use. From use. Someone had come down here regularly, recently. The descent was 12 feet. I counted the rungs. The wooden ladder was solid gym built. I knew immediately from the way the joints were cut and the rungs were set. No wobble, no flex. The man built things to last, and he built them to bear weight. When my feet touched the floor, I was standing on stone. I swept the flashlight in a slow arc. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12. The ceiling barely clearing my head, supported by rough-cut beams that looked as old as the house above. The walls were field stone, laid without mortar in some places, with it in others the work of someone who had learned as they went, but had gone carefully. The floor was stone as well, flat and fitted, worn smooth in the center, as if by years of footsteps. It was clean. Not recently cleaned, there was dust and the particular stillness of long, undisturbed air, but clean in the way of a space that had been maintained, that someone had cared about. No debris, no moisture damage despite the damp smell, no sign of any creature having found its way in. Against the far wall was a wooden shelf, rough-hewn from the same lumber as the ladder. On the shelf were 3 items. The first was a kerosene lantern, the old kind, with a glass chimney, a small amount of fuel still visible in the base. Beside it, a box of kitchen matches. The second was a wooden chair, simple and straight-backed, pushed up against the wall beneath the shelf. The seat was worn in a way that told me someone had sat in it many times. On the chair sat a Bible, the paperback kind, its cover soft and bent from handling its pages thick with the ghost of old annotations visible in the margins. The third item was on the shelf itself. A military ammunition can, the kind sold in surplus stores, painted a flat olive green. Heavy-duty waterproof, designed to protect its contents through conditions that would destroy everything else. It had a thick rubber-sealed lid and a heavy latch, and beside the latch, set into the face of the can, was a circular lock. The lock was dark iron. I already knew what would happen. I think I had known from the moment I found the key, the way you know certain things, not with your mind, but with something older and less articulable. I walked across the stone floor, my footsteps sounding impossibly loud in the sealed silence of the room. I reached the shelf. I looked at the lock. The keyhole was not a simple slit. It was a complex layered profile, toothed precise, designed for exactly one key. I lifted the iron key from around my neck. My hand was shaking. Not from fear exactly, from something more like the physical response to a moment you understand is significant before you fully understand why the body knowing before the mind catches up. I put the key into the lock. It slid in without resistance. Smooth and certain the way a thing fits when it was made to fit. I turned it. From inside the can came a series of mechanical clicks, clean sequential. The sound of a well-maintained lock doing what it was designed to do after a long time of waiting. The latch sprang open. I stood there with my hand on the key for a long moment. Below me, the open can. Above me, 12 feet of ladder and the cold Ohio air, and 16 days and a number Gareth Howell had told me that had sat in my chest like a stone ever since. I lifted the lid. The interior of the can was fitted with a foam insert shaped to hold its contents in place, the edges sealed against any moisture that might have found its way through. The contents were not what I expected. I don't know what I expected, money perhaps, or some document that would explain the debt and make everything simple. What I found was not simple. A stack of papers, dense and organized, held together by a binder clip. Beneath the papers, a stack of 3 audio cassettes, the old standard kind, labeled in Jim's block print, with dates spanning from 2003 to 2021. Beside the cassettes, a thick manila envelope sealed with tape, my name written on the front in ink that had faded but remained legible. And in the corner of the can, tucked beneath everything else, a small photograph in a protective sleeve. I picked up the photograph first. A man I didn't recognize in what appeared to be a prison visiting room, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who has been looking at the same 4 walls for too long. On the back, in Jim's handwriting, Danny Foss. Marysville Correctional, 2008. He didn't deserve it. I set the photograph down and picked up the stack of papers. The top sheet was a handwritten index, Jim's careful block print listing the contents in numbered order. I read it once. Then I read it again. My eyes moved slowly down the page, absorbing each item, each date, each name. Arthur Voss. The name appeared 11 times on the index page alone. By the time I reached the bottom of the index, my hands had stopped shaking. They had gone very still in the way that hands go still, when the brain has shifted into a different register, past shock, past confusion, into something colder and more focused. I sat down on the stone floor with the full stack of documents in my lap, my back against the cold fieldstone wall, my phone propped on the shelf above me for light. Outside, somewhere above, the March wind was moving through the bare trees around the house. Down here, nothing moved. I began to read. My father had not been only a mechanic. He had not been only a carpenter. He had not been only the quiet man who fixed his neighbor's lawn equipment and built furniture. He gave away because keeping it felt like bragging. He had been someone else first. Someone with a different last name and a different life and a set of choices made at 25 that had followed him across 3 decades, changing shape, but never leaving the way certain debts never leave. And for the past 22 years, for my entire life, he had been building something down here in the dark. Not hiding, not just surviving, building. The documents were meticulous, dated, cross-referenced, organized with the same obsessive precision he brought to his tool storage and his woodworking and every other domain of his life where precision was possible. They documented a pattern of financial coercion that stretched from 1999 to 2024, conducted by a man named Arthur Voss, through a series of corporate shells, Northgate Holdings among them, against at least a dozen individuals of whom James Michael Callahan was one. The cassette tapes were labeled by date. I didn't have a player, but Jim had anticipated that there was a small note clipped to the tape stack player in the green bag top shelf of the hall closet. It's been there for 20 years. I always planned to be the one to play these. He wasn't the one, so it would have to be me. I sat on the stone floor in the room my father had built with his own hands beneath the concrete floor of the garage where he had worked for 30 years, and I read everything he had left me. It took a long time. The cold settled deeper as the light faded above, but I barely noticed. The last thing I picked up was the sealed envelope with my name on it. I held it for a while without opening it. He had written my name in the same hand I'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter when he was going to be late. Nora. 4 letters. The most familiar word in his handwriting. I pressed the envelope gently. I could feel the thickness of what was inside, not a single letter, but several pages folded together. I did not open it that night. I wasn't ready. Something told me I needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with before I read whatever final thing he had to say to me directly. The documents first, then the tapes, then his words. I climbed the ladder slowly. At the top, I stood in the workshop for a moment, blinking in the darkness, the overhead light still on the familiar smells of oil and wood dust, the half-boxed tools on the workbench, the photograph still lying where I'd left it. The Last Good Night, 1991. I picked up the photograph and looked at it again. The young man on the left, with his arms crossed, assessing something beyond the frame of the image. The same jaw, the same stance, the same quality of contained alertness. He looked like someone who believed he was at the beginning of something. I now knew he was standing at the edge of the thing that would define the rest of his life. I turned off the workshop light and walked back into the house. I found the green bag on the top shelf of the hall closet, exactly where Jim's note said it would be. Inside was a cassette player, the kind with a single speaker, and a belt drive mechanism, old and slightly battered, but clean and obviously maintained. There were fresh batteries in the compartment. Of course there were. He had always prepared for everything. He had spent 22 years preparing for the moment when he would not be here, and I would need what he had left behind. I sat at the kitchen table with the cassette player and the stack of tapes and the sealed envelope with my name on it. And I thought about the kind of love that expresses itself not in words, but in preparation, in forethought, in the patient, quiet act of building something for someone else to find. He never said, "I love you," but he had built a room underground and filled a box with 20 years of evidence and left me a key in a hidden compartment and written, "Forgive me," on a piece of paper, and spent the last months of his life making sure that when the moment came, when Northgate Holdings sent their notice and the house was threatened, and I was alone and 18 and had no idea what to do, I would not be without a map. That was Jim Callahan's language. I had just learned to read it. Outside the kitchen window, the Ohio dark was absolute and cold and very still. The house made its familiar sounds around me. The tick of the baseboard, heat, the faint groan of the structure in the wind. The small, intimate noises of a building that has been lived in for a long time. 16 days. I picked up the first cassette tape and turned it over in my hand. The label read, "Arthur Voss. Phone call. March 12th, 2003. He doesn't know I'm recording." I put the tape in the player. I pressed play, and my father's voice came out of the small speaker into the quiet kitchen, younger than I had ever heard it, tighter, with something that took me a moment to identify. Fear. Pure and carefully controlled fear. And then another voice, smooth and deliberate and completely certain of itself. And I began to understand the shape of the thing my father had lived inside for 30 years. I listened until the tape ended. Then I picked up the sealed envelope with my name on it, and this time I opened it. The letter was 7 pages long. Jim Callahan had never been a man of many words. He ordered from menus by pointing. He answered most questions with a nod or a single syllable. In 30 years of living in Harlow, Ohio, he had probably said less than most people say in a month. So 7 pages in his careful block print, each letter formed with the same deliberateness he brought to cutting a dovetail joint, was the equivalent of another man writing a novel. I read it at the kitchen table with the cassette player beside me, and the wind pressing against the windows, and the house settling around me in the dark. He began with the year 1991. He had been 25. He had been living in Columbus, working at a body shop, making enough to cover his rent and not much else. He was not a bad person, he wrote, underlining the sentence, "once a thing he did," nowhere else in the letter. He was young and broke, and convinced, the way young broke people sometimes are, that the rules governing other people's lives did not have to govern his. That there was a smarter way, a faster way. That patience was for people who had something worth waiting for. He had met a man named Victor Greel through a mutual contact at the body shop. Greel was 10 years older, well-dressed, in the way that suggested money without announcing it. And he had a quality Jim described in the letter as gravitational, the kind of presence that made you feel when you were in the room with him that being close to him was itself a form of protection. Greal ran a small crew. They moved stolen goods occasionally. They facilitated certain financial arrangements that did not bear scrutiny. Nothing violent, Greal was careful to emphasize. They were not that kind of people. They were businessmen operating outside a system that was itself corrupt. Jim had driven for them. That was all at first. He was good with vehicles, fast, calm under pressure, possessed of the particular spatial intelligence that makes someone genuinely exceptional behind the wheel. He drove. He asked no questions. He was paid in cash. He wrote, "I told myself I wasn't really part of it. I was just the transportation. I told myself that for about 8 months, until I stopped being able to believe it. By then, it didn't matter. By then, he had driven on 4 jobs, and his face was known, and his name was in Greal's phone, and there was no clean way out that didn't involve walking away from everything and starting over somewhere else entirely. He had considered it. He wrote that he had considered it seriously, had even packed a bag once and sat on the edge of his bed with it and thought about just leaving. But there was a woman named Elaine by then. My mother. He had met her at a diner where she waitressed on weekends. She was 23 and studying nursing, and she had a laugh that he wrote made the whole room recalibrate itself around her. He had been in love with her for 6 months before he had the courage to say so. By the time he was thinking about packing a bag and disappearing, she was the reason he couldn't. He stayed. He kept driving. He kept telling himself it was temporary. Then came Arthur Voss. Voss was not part of Greal's crew. Voss was something else entirely. He came into the picture in the spring of 1994, introduced by Greal as a financial consultant, someone who could help the crew move their money into legitimate channels, clean it up, make it safe. He was 50 at the time, impeccably dressed. Former federal agent, though he had left the bureau under circumstances no one seemed to want to discuss directly. He had the manner of a man completely comfortable with the authority he carried, because his authority came not from any external institution, but from himself alone. Jim wrote, "The first time I sat across a table from Arthur Voss, I understood something I had never understood before. There are people in this world who are genuinely dangerous, not because they are violent, but because they are certain. Voss was certain about everything. He never raised his voice because he never needed to. He simply knew things, and the knowing of them was enough. What Voss knew, it emerged over time, was everything. He had spent 14 years in federal law enforcement, the last 6 in financial crimes. In that time, he had built a knowledge base of remarkable specificity, how money moved, where it hid, what patterns drew attention and what patterns didn't, which institutions could be leveraged and which ones were genuinely clean. He had also built something else, a private archive of information gathered during his federal years that had never made it into official case files. Names, transactions, relationships. The kind of material that in the right hands was worth considerably more than anything Greel's crew had ever stolen. When Voss left the Bureau in 1998, he took that archive with him. What he built with it was not a criminal enterprise in any traditional sense. It was a system of sustained financial coercion. He identified people and entities with exploitable vulnerabilities, people who had done things, or who were connected to people who had done things, or who simply had the misfortune of having accumulated something worth taking. He attached himself to those vulnerabilities, and then he squeezed slowly and consistently, in the manner of something that is in no hurry because it is very sure of the outcome. Jim Callahan had been one of his targets since 1999. Not because of anything dramatic, because Voss had a record of Jim's involvement with Greel's crew from his federal days, and because Jim had by then built something worth threatening. He had married Elaine. He had moved to Harlow. He had built a small life with real things in it. A house, a business, a child on the way. The first contact was a phone call. Voss did not threaten. He informed. He described with precise detail Jim's participation in 4 specific incidents between 1991 and 1993. He named dates, locations, amounts. He explained in the measured tone of a man discussing something of mutual interest that this information existed in various documented forms, and that the question of what happened to it was at least in part negotiable. The negotiation was simple: a monthly payment to an account associated with Northgate Holdings, a figure that was painful but survivable. In exchange, the information stayed where it was. No contact with law enforcement, no contact with the people Jim had left behind. Just a monthly payment, regular as a utility bill, for as long as Voss determined it was necessary. Jim paid. He paid for 25 years. He paid through my birth and through my mother's illness and through her death when I was 4 years old, and through every year of my growing up. He paid through the slow decline of his health, and through the 18 months of cancer, and through the dwindling of his savings into something that barely covered the medical bills. He paid until the month he died, when the automatic transfer went through 6 days before his last breath. Because he had not figured out how to stop it without consequences, he could no longer manage. He paid to keep me safe. He wrote that near the end of the letter, not as self-justification, but as simple statement of fact, the way he stated everything. I paid to keep you safe. It was the only leverage I had against him, and I used it every month for 25 years. He couldn't touch you as long as he needed me to keep paying. And then, when I was gone, he would come for the house. I always knew that. It was always going to be the last payment. I just needed to make sure you were ready when he did. I set the letter down on the kitchen table. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved through the trees at the edge of the property with a low traveling sound, the kind of sound that seems like it's trying to tell you something in a language you almost understand. My father had paid a man 25 years of monthly installments to protect me from the consequences of choices he had made before I existed. He had never said a word. Not one word. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The grief was still there. It had been there since August, when he sat across from me with 2 cups of coffee and told me about his pancreas in the same tone he used to discuss tire pressure. But now it had company. Something harder and more directional. Something that knew where it wanted to point. There was a name in the letter that appeared 3 times in the final 2 pages. The last time it appeared, it was accompanied by a phone number and a single sentence of instruction. She has been waiting longer than you have. She deserves to know first. The name was Winifred Dean. Jim's letter described her in spare terms. Former investigative reporter, Columbus Dispatch. Lost her position in 2008 under circumstances connected, though never provably, to Arthur Voss. Had been pursuing Voss independently on her own time and her own resources for 17 years. Had come close once in 2008, when a source she never identified had agreed to provide corroborating documentation for a story she had spent 14 months building. The source withdrew at the last moment. The story died. The source was my father. He had written in the plain declarative style he used for everything I was her source. I pulled out 3 days before publication because Voss called me and told me that if the story ran, he would make sure you were taken from me. You were 3 years old. Your mother had been gone for 2 years. You were all I had left. I made the only choice I was capable of making. I have lived with it since. The sealed envelope inside the box, the one addressed to Winifred Dean, do not open unless Jim is gone, contained, according to Jim's letter, a written account of everything he had withheld from her in 2008. Along with copies of the 3 most critical documents in the Hoso box selected specifically to give her story the evidentiary foundation it had lacked the first time. He had prepared it 18 months ago, immediately after his diagnosis. He had known from the moment the oncologist used the word pancreatic that the time for waiting was finished. I found Winifred Dean on a Tuesday morning, 2 days after I first opened the box. She wasn't hard to find. She had a professional website, Spare Functional. The kind of site built by someone who understood its purpose was information delivery rather than self-promotion. It listed her as an independent investigative journalist based in Cleveland, contributing to several regional publications and running her own newsletter on Ohio political and financial corruption. The newsletter had a modest following. Her byline on the contributing publications was infrequent, but when I looked at the subjects, consistent in its focus. Arthur Voss had been mentioned tangentially in 3 of her pieces over the past 6 years. Never by name. Always as an unnamed figure in a pattern of financial influence that she documented carefully and attributed only to sources she described as familiar with the relevant transactions. She was circling him. She had been circling him for 17 years, coming as close as she could without the thing she needed to actually land. I called the number on the website. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was what I had expected from the website direct. No warm-up, slightly impatient in the way of someone whose time has been wasted before and intends to prevent it from happening again. I told her my name. I told her my father's name. The silence that followed was brief but complete. "Where are you?" she said. We met that afternoon at a diner in Medina, roughly equidistant between Harlow and Cleveland. She was already there when I arrived, in a corner booth with her back to the wall and a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. She was 58, with silver-streaked hair, cut practically short, and the posture of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. She wore no jewelry except a watch. She had a legal pad on the table and a pen she didn't pick up when I sat down. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. "You look like him," she said, around the eyes. I put the sealed envelope on the table between us. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and opened it with the careful efficiency of someone who has been handling documents their entire professional life. She read in silence. I drank my coffee and watched the parking lot and left her alone with whatever my father had written to her directly, the words he'd had to write to a stranger, because writing them to me would have required explaining things he had decided to explain in a different order. She read for a long time. When she set the pages down, her face had changed. Not broken. Winifred Dean did not appear to be a woman who broke easily, but altered. The professional assessment had shifted into something more complicated. Something that sat at the intersection of grief and vindication and a very old, very controlled anger. "He was my source," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "He pulled out." "Yes." "To protect you." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the pages on the table between us. Then she said something I had not expected. "I know," she said. "I always thought it was probably something like that. Sources don't pull out at the last minute for no reason. There's always something they're protecting. I spent a long time being angry at him." She paused. "I spent a shorter time understanding." She looked up at me. "What else is in the box?" I told her. All of it. The documents, the cassette tapes, the index in Jim's handwriting, the photograph from 1991. I told her about Northgate Holdings and the 16 days and Gareth Howell's phone call and the number that had sat in my chest like a stone. I told her about the underground room, about the cassette player with fresh batteries that he had maintained for 20 years against this exact moment. She listened the way good listeners listen, without interruption, without visible reaction, taking everything in and filing it before responding to any of it. When I finished, she picked up her pen for the first time. "Arthur Voss," she said, writing the name at the top of her legal pad. "Tell me what your father's documents say about him specifically." So I told her that too. The revelation about Voss's background stopped her pen mid-stroke. "Former federal agent," she said. "Financial Crimes Division, 14 years. That's why." She said it quietly, more to herself than to me. "That's why nothing ever sticks to him. He knows exactly where the lines are because he spent 14 years drawing them. She set the pen down. That's also why your father couldn't go to law enforcement. Voss still has relationships inside the system. Not with everyone, but enough. Enough to make a report disappear or to make the person who filed it look like they had reasons to fabricate. That's what the letter says. Your father was smarter than I gave him credit for, she said. And then after a beat, I'm sorry, that came out wrong. It didn't, I said. He was smarter than most people gave him credit for. He just didn't do anything with it for a long time. She looked at me steadily. He did something with it, she said. He built that box. That took intelligence and patience and a very clear understanding of what he was building it for. She picked up the envelope again. He built it for you. That was the moment I came closest to losing my composure in front of a stranger. I looked at the parking lot and breathed carefully for a few seconds. Will the documents be enough? I asked. Combined with the tapes, if they contain what he says they contain, yes, potentially. But I need to hear the tapes, and I need to have everything verified before I can tell you how strong this is. She paused. And there's another problem. She told me about the problem. Her newsletter operated independently, which meant it was small. Small enough that a single legal challenge from Voss's attorneys could tie it up in litigation long enough to render it irrelevant. She had gone that route before a piece in 2019 that had drawn a cease and desist within 48 hours and had cost her 18 months of legal fees to defend. She had won, technically. The damage had already been done. We need multiple outlets, she said. Simultaneous publication across platforms large enough that suppressing all of them at once would be impossible. Your father's documents suggest exactly that strategy. I want you to know he thought about this. He wrote it in the index, I said. I saw. For the first time, something in her expression softened fractionally. He planned for this the way he planned everything else, carefully, over a long time, without ever letting on. She gathered the pages back into the envelope and folded her hands on the table. I want you to understand something, Nora, she said. What your father left you is not just evidence. It's a case file. It's 22 years of methodical, organized documentation built by a man who understood better than most trained journalists what makes a case hold. The hard work is already done. What we need to do now is move it from that basement to somewhere Voss can't reach it. She paused. How quickly can you get me copies of everything? 2 days later, Prescott Slade came to the house. I knew who he was before he introduced himself. He was 45, dressed in the particular way of men who bill by the hour at rates that justify the expense of looking expensive. He drove a black sedan that was not quite a luxury car, but was clearly trying to be. He walked up the porch steps with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never had to knock twice. He introduced himself, stated his firm, and then explained in the measured cadence of a prepared statement that his client, Northgate Holdings, was prepared to offer a resolution that he believed I would find favorable. The lien on the property, he said, could be forgiven entirely. Beyond that, his client was prepared to offer a cash settlement, the figure for which he named, with the same neutral tone you'd use to discuss the weather. It was a large number, large enough that I understood hearing it that Voss already knew about the box. He might not know everything that was in it, but he knew it existed.
In exchange, Slade said, my client asks only that any personal property belonging to your father that pertains to his prior business dealings with Northgate be surrendered. Documents, recordings, correspondence, whatever may be in your possession. He smiled. It was a professional smile, practiced and meaningless. Your father was a pragmatic man, Miss Callahan, he said. I hope you've inherited that quality.
I looked at him for a moment. I'll think about it, I said. He gave me his card. He left. I sat on the porch steps after his car had gone and thought about the word pragmatic, about the way it had been applied to my father by a man who had never met him, as a way of suggesting that my father's defining quality had been a willingness to make peace with things he couldn't change. My father had not made peace with those things. He had spent 22 years documenting them. That night, I drove to Gareth Howell's house. Gareth lived 12 minutes from us in a small colonial he'd owned for 40 years, and he answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, and the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit without knowing exactly when it would arrive. He led me to his study and poured 2 glasses of bourbon he didn't ask if I wanted, and he sat down across from me and looked at me with the steady, worn patience of a man who has delivered difficult news so many times it has become a kind of vocation.
You found the box,
he said. It wasn't a question. He told you about it, I said.
He told me enough.
Gareth turned his glass in his hands. Jim came to see me in September, 8 months before he died. He sat in that chair you're sitting in now, and he told me he was going to lose his fight with the cancer. He was very clear about it. He didn't frame it as a possibility. He said, I'm going to lose this, and when I do, I need you to understand your role.
What was your role?
Gareth reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and produced a manila envelope sealed my name on the front in Jim's handwriting. A twin to the one I'd found in the box.
He gave me this,
Gareth said. He said if Nora comes to you, and only if she comes to you of her own accord, after finding what I've left her, give her this. Don't call her. Don't go to her. Wait for her to come. He set the envelope on the desk between us. He said he needed you to make the first choice on your own. He needed to know that what you decided wasn't because someone handed you a direction. He wanted it to come from you. I looked at the envelope. What's in it? I asked.
A second set of the most critical documents from his files, Gareth said, and authorization for me to act as your legal representative in any proceedings related to the Northgate lien. He paused. He also left me something else, a letter for me personally explaining everything. He trusted me with the full picture.
Gareth looked at me steadily. I want you to know that I have spent the 8 months since that conversation wishing there had been something I could have done sooner. For your father, I could not, but I can help you now.
Slade came to the house, I said. Voss's lawyer. I know. He filed a motion this morning to accelerate the foreclosure timeline. Gareth picked up his glass. He does that when he wants to create pressure. Force a quick decision before the other side has time to prepare. Can you stop it?
Temporarily. I can file for an injunction on grounds of disputed ownership pending investigation into the origination of the lien. It won't hold indefinitely, but it will buy us time. He looked at me. The question is what you intend to do with the time. I told him about Winifred Dean. He listened without expression, his glass held still in one hand. When I finished, he set the glass down with care.
Your father mentioned her, he said. He said she was the right person. He said she had waited long enough and that she would know what to do when the moment came. He was quiet for a moment. He trusted her, not easily and not without guilt, but he trusted her. She's working on authentication now, I said. She needs 2 more days. Then we need to protect the source material for 2 more days, Gareth said. He reached into the desk and produced a key on a plain ring. Fireproof safe in the office of my colleague's firm in Akron. No connection to me or to you. The original documents go there tomorrow morning. You bring me the originals. I drive them there myself. He looked at me over his reading glasses. Arthur Voss is a careful man, but he has never dealt with Jim Callahan's daughter before. I drove home through the Ohio dark, with the second envelope on the passenger seat and the bourbon warm in my chest, and something reorganizing itself in the center of my understanding of the past 18 years of my life. My father had not just built a box. He had built a network, modest and quiet and constructed over years the way he built everything. One careful piece at a time, each piece fitted to the next with attention to the joints. Gareth Howell, in his colonial 12 Minutes Away. Winifred Dean in Cleveland, with her legal pad and her 17 years of circling. The cassette player with fresh batteries. The second envelope delivered to the right person with the right instructions. He had been alone in that underground room. But he had not been building something only for himself. He had been building it for this. I was unlocking the front door when my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. The voice was male, middle-aged, flat, with the particular flatness of someone reading from a prepared statement. Miss Callahan, you should know that the offer Mr. Slade communicated is time-limited. It expires at the end of business Friday. After that, Northgate's position changes. How does it change? I asked. A pause. In ways that would be unfortunate for you, the voice said. Your father understood how to manage his situation. We're hoping you've inherited his pragmatism. There was that word again, pragmatic. I thought about my father sitting alone in that stone room in the cold, in the dark, with a Bible
on a wooden chair, and a cassette recorder, and 20 years of evidence building slowly in an olive green box. I thought about what it cost to do that quietly, year after year, without telling anyone, without breaking under the weight of it. I thought about what kind of man that took, what kind of love that took. Tell me something, I said. Does Mr. Voss know my father kept records?
Another pause, longer this time. Miss Callahan. Because if he does, I said, then he already knows the offer doesn't matter. And if he doesn't, then you're going to want to tell him. Either way, the answer is no. I hung up. I stood in the dark hallway of the house my father had lived in for 22 years and paid for in ways I was only now fully understanding, and I felt something settle into place in my chest. Not courage exactly, more like clarity. The particular calm that comes when a decision has been made and you have stopped arguing with yourself about it. 2 days later, Winifred Dean called me. She had spent 48 hours with the cassette tapes and the documents. She had contacted 3 people she trusted with specific technical and legal questions. She had reached out quietly to 2 editors at publications significantly larger than her newsletter. The tapes are extraordinary, she said. The documentation is extraordinary. The most recent recording is from November 2021. Your father was still gathering material 18 months before he died. The last tape alone establishes a pattern of coercion that any federal prosecutor would recognize immediately. Is it enough? I asked. It is more than enough, she said. It is frankly more than I have ever had on any subject in 30 years of investigative reporting. She paused. Your father was meticulous, Nora. He was extraordinary in his own quiet way. I know, I said. The 2 editors I spoke with want to proceed. We're looking at simultaneous publication, 3 outlets coordinated. Your father's strategy from the index. Another pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed slightly. A quality entering it that she had been keeping at a controlled distance. The story is going to be significant. It's going to reach people. It's going to do what it was meant to do. When? I asked. We need 1 more week to verify the final documents and coordinate the legal review. Then we go. I was quiet for a moment. There's something else, Fred said. Someone broke into my car last night. Nothing was taken. I don't keep source materials in my car. But they were looking for something. Voss knows something is moving. He doesn't know exactly what or exactly where, but he's starting to feel the edges of it. The originals are in Akron, I said. Gareth moved them this morning. Good. She exhaled slowly. 1 week, Nora. We just need 1 week. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the house that had been my father's. And before that, nobody's in particular, and I thought about 1 week. About what could happen in 1 week, and what we needed to prevent from happening. My phone lit up on the table. A text from an unknown number, just 6 words.
We know about the basement. Last chance. I set the phone face down on the table. 1 week. I picked up the photograph from 1991. I had brought it inside the night I found it, and it had been living on the kitchen table since then, leaning against the salt shaker, the 4 young men, and the panel van, and the bare November trees. My father's face, 25 years old, standing at the left edge of the frame with his arms crossed, looking at something beyond the camera with an expression I had finally identified. He wasn't looking at the camera because he was already thinking about what came next. He was always already thinking about what came next. 1 week. The text sat on my phone for 11 minutes before I responded. I didn't respond to the number. I responded to the situation. I went down into the basement room, climbed the ladder with the full set of copied documents in a canvas bag, and spent the next 4 hours doing the thing my father had described in the index. The thing I had been thinking about since Winifred Dean told me someone had searched her car. Jim had written it in the second-to-last entry of the index in the same block print he used for everything without emphasis or drama, as if it were simply another item on a list of tools to be organized. If you are reading this because something has gone wrong before the story can run, there is a secondary protocol. 3 copies, 3 separate locations, 3 separate people. No single point of failure. He had named the 3 people. Gareth Howell already had the originals in Akron. Winifred Dean had the authenticated copies in Cleveland. The third name was a woman named Ruth Callahan, my father's older sister, whom I had met exactly 4 times in my life, at intervals so spread out they felt like separate lifetimes. She lived in Spokane, Washington. She was 63 years old, and she had worked for 30 years as a county records clerk, which meant she understood better than most civilians how documents were filed and stored, and how they could be made to survive. Jim had called her 18 months ago after the diagnosis. He had explained enough, and she had agreed to hold a sealed package in her home safe without opening it and without discussing it with anyone until she heard from me directly. I called her at 9 in the evening Ohio time, which made it 6 in Washington. She answered on the first ring. "Nora," she said. Just my name, the way my father said everything, without decoration, the word itself doing all the necessary work. "Aunt Ruth," I said, "did he tell you this call might come?" "He told me it would come," she said. "He didn't say might." A brief pause. "Are you all right?" "I'm all right," I said. "I need you to know that the package is going to matter in the next few days. I need you to keep it where it is." "It hasn't moved since the day it arrived," she said. "Tell me what you need. I told her. She listened without interruption, asked 2 precise questions, the kind of questions that came from 30 years of handling documents and understanding what made them legally legible. And then she said, "I'll be here. Whatever time it is, when you need me, I'll be here." "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank your father. He thought of everything." She was quiet for a moment. He called me when your mother died, you know. He called me at 2 in the morning, and he didn't say anything for almost a minute. Just breathed. And then he said, I don't know how to do this, Ruth. And I said, you just do it, James. One day at a time. You just do it. Another pause. He was better at that than anyone I've ever known.
Doing hard things one day at a time without making a production of it.
I said good night and hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in my hand and the house quiet around me. 3 copies, 3 locations, 3 people who would not be reached simultaneously by a man who, despite all his power, still operated through intermediaries and pressure points and the threat of legal processes that took time. The secondary protocol was in place. Now we needed the week. The week did not go quietly.
On the second day, Prescott Slade filed a motion to accelerate the foreclosure proceedings, citing what he described as the deteriorating condition of the property and the respondent's failure to engage in good faith negotiation. Gareth Howell filed a counter motion within 3 hours, citing disputed origination of the lien instrument and requesting a 30-day stay pending investigation. The judge granted a 14-day stay. Not 30, 14. Gareth called me from the courthouse parking lot.
It's less than I wanted, he said. It's more than we had. 14 days is enough if Winifred moves on schedule. She's moving on schedule, I said.
On the 4th day, a man I didn't recognize sat in a parked car across the street from the house for 6 hours. He didn't get out. He didn't approach. He just sat there in a gray sedan with Ohio plates and watched the house with the particular patience of someone being paid by the hour to be patient. I took photographs of the car and the plates from the upstairs window and sent them to both Gareth and Fred. Gareth sent back document everything, time duration description, don't engage. Fred sent back, good, let him sit. He's not there to do anything. He's there to make you feel watched. I felt watched. But I also felt something else. The cold, focused anger that had been building since the night I first sat on the stone floor and read my father's documents. It had not diminished over the days. It had refined itself. It had become less like emotion and more like orientation. A direction I was pointed in, steady and irrevocable. On the 5th day, a woman called claiming to be from the county assessor's office and asked if she could come by to conduct a property inspection required as part of the foreclosure proceedings. I told her I would need to verify her credentials through the assessor's office directly before scheduling any visit. She said, of course, perfectly reasonable, gave me a name and a number. I called the actual county assessor's office. They had never heard of her. I called Gareth.
They're looking for a way into the house,
he said.
They still don't know the full extent of what you have. They're trying to find out.
He paused.
Don't let anyone in.
I wasn't going to, I said.
On the 6th day, Winifred Dean drove to Harlow and sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours. She brought her legal pad and a laptop and a thermos of coffee she didn't offer to share, which I found oddly comforting. A woman who operated without social performance. She spread her materials across the table and walked me through the final structure of the story. The 3 outlets and their editorial timelines. The legal review process each piece had gone through. The specific claims that were fully documented and the ones presented more carefully as established patterns. The story was not just about Arthur Voss. It was about the system that had allowed Arthur Voss. It was about the specific mechanisms by which a man with federal law enforcement credentials could exit that institution, carrying an archive of non-public information, and use it over decades to construct a private empire of coercion that never quite crossed the lines that would have triggered the kind of aggressive institutional response that might have stopped him. It was about why a man like Jim Callahan, who had been wronged, who had evidence, who was a citizen with legal standing, could not walk into a police station and report it. It was a story about power, and about what power costs the people who live closest to it.
Your father appears in this story, Fred said, looking at me across the table. Not by name, but his situation is the central case study. His role in the original circumstances that gave Voss leverage over him is described accurately. She held my gaze. I want you to understand that going in. I understand, I said. He's described fairly, she said. He was 25, and he made choices that weren't good ones. He spent the rest of his life making different choices. Both of those things are in the piece. That's accurate, I said. He comes across as a man of genuine character, she said, and her voice changed slightly on the word. Genuine weighted it in a way that told me she meant it without performance. I want you to know that. I looked at the kitchen table, the water ring from a coffee cup left there years ago that he had always meant to sand out. He was, I said. Fred left at 4 in the afternoon. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at me. One more day, she said. We go tomorrow night. Simultaneous publication, 11 p.m. Eastern. By morning, it will have been read by more people than Voss can manage. She looked at me steadily. Your father built this. You carried it. I want you to understand what that means. I'm beginning to, I said. She nodded once and left. I locked the door and went back to the kitchen and sat in the chair where my father had sat every morning for 22 years. The chair with the slight list to the left that he had shimmed but never quite corrected. I sat in his chair and put my hands flat on the table and looked at the water ring and the afternoon light moving across the floor, and I thought about tomorrow night. Then the knock came. Not a knock like Prescott Slade's brisk professional, the knock of a man announcing his own importance. This knock was measured. 3 quiet contacts with the door evenly spaced, the kind of knock that communicates I am in no hurry because I have nothing to be hurried about. I went to the door. Arthur Voss was 70 years old, and he looked exactly like the voice on the cassette tapes, which is to say, he looked like a man for whom authority was not something external conferred by institutions or titles, but internal, grown in over decades. until it had become simply the texture of how he moved through the world. He was tall and lean, his white hair combed with care, his coat a dark gray wool that hung with the ease of something expensive, worn often.
He had the eyes of a man who had spent a career reading people and had long since stopped being surprised by what he found. He was alone. No Slade, no gray sedan. Just Arthur Voss standing on my father's porch in the late afternoon light of an Ohio March day, his hands at his sides, looking at me with an expression that was almost warm. "Miss Callahan," he said, "may I come in?" The reasonable answer was no. The strategically sound answer was also no. But I thought about what Fred had told me, and about what Gareth had said, and about the secondary protocol with its 3 copies in 3 places that no single conversation could undo, and I said yes.
He sat in the kitchen. The same chair Winifred Dean had sat in 6 hours earlier across the table from the chair where my father had sat every morning. He folded his hands on the table, the gesture of a man accustomed to conference tables and depositions, accustomed to the particular theater of appearing reasonable. He did not open with a threat. He did not open with an offer. He said, "Your father and I knew each other for a long time." "I know," I said. "He was an intelligent man," Voss said, genuinely. Not educated in the formal sense, but genuinely intelligent, which is rarer. He had good instincts, and he was disciplined in a way that most people are not. He paused. "I want you to know that I respected him." I said nothing. "What existed between us was a business arrangement," Voss continued in the same measured cadence, the same quality of absolute self-possession. "An arrangement that had a logic to it, even if the terms were not ones he chose freely. He understood that logic. He never tried to pretend otherwise." He looked at me across the table. "I think you understand it too." "What logic is that?" I said. "Consequences," he said simply. "Everything has consequences. The choices your father made at 25 had consequences. The arrangement we reached allowed him to manage those consequences in a way that preserved what he had built: his home, his reputation, his daughter's life. He paid a cost for that preservation, but he had something worth preserving." He tilted his head slightly. "I am here because I believe you have something worth preserving as well." "You're here because you know about the box," I said. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He simply held the same expression. "I'm here," he said, "because I would prefer a resolution that doesn't require further disruption to either of our lives. You are 18 years old. You have, as far as I can determine, done nothing wrong. Whatever your father's arrangements with me, they are not your burden to inherit." He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table, a gesture of openness. "The lien on this property can be dissolved today, this afternoon. You can keep the house, your father's belongings, whatever he left you.
You can begin your life without the weight of his history following you. He paused. All I ask is that whatever documents or recordings he may have compiled be surrendered, comprehensively, with confirmation. He said it the way you say something to a child who you believe with genuine benevolence does not fully understand the situation. Patient, clear, giving the other person every opportunity to arrive at the obviously correct conclusion. He was not performing cruelty. That was the thing about Arthur Voss. He had convinced himself over decades of doing what he did that he was not cruel, that he was practical, that the arrangements he imposed were simply the management of consequences that already existed, and that his role was closer to accountant than oppressor. My father had understood this about him. He had written about it in the letter. The most dangerous thing about Voss is not that he is evil. It's that he is certain he is not. I let him finish. I let the silence after his words sit in the kitchen for a moment, the way Jim Callahan would have let it sit without rushing to fill it, without showing what the silence contained. Then I said, "Mr. Voss, can I ask you something?" He indicated that I could. When you called my father in March of 2003, I said, "The first call, the one where you explained the arrangement, how long did you plan to keep it going?" He studied me for a moment. "That's not a relevant question to the current." 25 years, I said. "You kept it going for 25 years, through his wife dying, through his daughter growing up, through his cancer. The last automatic payment went through 6 days before he died." I kept my voice level. The anger was there, but it was deep, and it was under control where it had been for days now. "I want you to understand that I've heard the tapes, all of them, 18 years of recorded phone calls. I've read everything he documented. I know the names of every shell company. I know the timeline. I know about the Federal Archive you took when you left the Bureau." I paused. "I know everything." He was still for a moment. The warm expression had not disappeared exactly. It had become more careful. "Then you understand," he said quietly, "why it would be better for everyone." "I sent it all last night," I said. The careful expression went very still. "Encrypted copies," I said, "to Winifred Dean, to 2 editors at 2 separate publications, and to a federal tip line that I'm told routes to a division that has no connection to the Bureau relationships you've maintained since 2001. I let that sit for a moment. My father's index included instructions for exactly this contingency. He thought of it 3 years ago, and he wrote it down, and he left it for me. I held Voss's gaze. "The story publishes tonight. There's nothing that happens in this kitchen that changes that." Arthur Voss looked at me across the kitchen table of the house he had been threatening to take for 25 years. I watched him process it. I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the assessment, the rapid inventory of options and their outcomes, the recognition of the thing my father had understood about him, and had spent 2 decades planning around. He was a man who operated through leverage, and the leverage was gone. He stood up. He straightened his coat with the careful habit of a man who has always presented himself precisely. He picked up nothing because he had brought nothing with him. And then he did something I had not expected. He looked at the kitchen, not at me, at the room itself, the watering on the table, the coffee maker on the counter,
the pegboard by the door where Jim's keys had hung for 22 years. He looked at it all with an expression that briefly was not calculated at all.
He built this well, Voss said quietly. Not about the documentation, about the house, about the life. Then he walked to the door, and he left without another word. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the dark car move slowly down the gravel driveway and disappear around the bend.
Oh, the late afternoon light was going gold through the bare trees. The property was very still. A pair of birds moved through the branches at the tree line and were gone. I stood there for a long time.
Then I called Winifred Dean. He was here, I said. I know, she said. Your neighbor called me. The woman 3 doors down. She's been watching the house since the gray sedan. Your father apparently told her to watch. A pause. He really did think of everything. Did you get what I sent last night? I did, she said. I was going to call you this morning, but I thought... She stopped. The federal tip. That was a good instinct, Nora. The division it roots to has been building a separate file on Voss's post-bureau financial activity for 4 years. Your material is going to complete a picture they've been working with partial information. They called me 3 hours ago. They are moving. The story published at 11 p.m. that night across 3 platforms simultaneously. I was sitting at the kitchen table when it went live. I watched the first publication appear on my laptop screen, the headline, clean and precise. The kind of headline that Fred had explained was designed to be impossible to misread and difficult to legally challenge. Below it, in her byline, the word investigative that she had spent 17 years earning back. I read the piece once, beginning to end. My father was not named. He was described as a source who had spent over 2 decades building a documented record of Voss's activities at considerable personal cost, who had ensured the record would survive him and reach the appropriate recipients. He was described as a man who had made serious mistakes when young and had spent the remainder of his life making a different set of choices. The piece was 22,000 words long. It was the longest thing I had ever read in a single sitting. By midnight, it had been shared widely enough that 3 major news organizations had filed their own requests for the underlying documentation. By 2 a.m., a federal spokesperson confirmed that an investigation into the financial activities of Arthur Voss and associated entities was ongoing, and that new evidence had been received and was being evaluated. By morning, the world had changed.
Gareth Howell called at 8 a.m.
"It's over, Nora," he said. His voice carried something I had not heard in it before, a lightness, almost a warmth, as if he had set down something he had been carrying for a long time. Northgate Holdings filed a voluntary dissolution of the lien instrument 20 minutes ago. The attorneys for Voss's other entities have been withdrawing from proceedings across the board since 6 a.m. The house is yours, free and clear. I set the phone down on the kitchen table.
I sat in my father's chair, the one with the slight list to the left that he had shimmed but never corrected. And I cried. Not the way I had cried in the first days after his death, the lost, formless grief of someone from whom something has been taken with no explanation. This was different. This had shape and direction. I cried for the man who had sat in this chair every morning for 22 years, carrying a weight he had never once set down in my presence. I cried for the 25 years of payments and the fear that attended every month of those payments, and the particular terror of a man who loves someone and cannot protect them through any clean or uncomplicated means. I cried for the room he had built underground with his own hands and sat alone in with a Bible and a cassette recorder and the cold patience of a man doing the only thing available to him. I cried until there was nothing left to cry. Then I washed my face, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and watched the morning light move across the yard. Arthur Voss was indicted 8 weeks later on federal charges that included extortion, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and the unauthorized retention and use of classified federal law enforcement materials. Prescott Slade received a separate set of charges related to his role in structuring the fraudulent lien instruments. The gray sedan never came back. The unknown number never called again. The process would take time. Federal cases always did. But the structure Voss had built, the network of shell companies and leveraged relationships and carefully maintained silence, had been exposed in enough detail that the structure itself had already collapsed. The empire did not require a verdict to fall. It required only light. My father had understood that. He had written it in the letter, one of the last things he wrote before the signature. He is not afraid of courts. He has survived courts before. He is afraid of public record. He is afraid of a story that cannot be legally suppressed because it has been too widely distributed. That is the only weapon that can actually reach him. That is why I built what I built, the way I built it. 3 weeks after the lien was dissolved, I drove to Cleveland and had lunch with Winifred Dean. We ate at a restaurant she chose, a small, unfussy place near her apartment that specialized in things that were good without being complicated. She had the same legal pad she'd had at the diner in Medina, though today she didn't open it. We talked for 2 hours about things that were not primarily Arthur Voss. She told me about the 17 years of trying, about the pieces she had been able to publish and the ones she hadn't, and what it had felt like to carry a story she knew was true but could not adequately prove, about what it meant to have that change.
"What are you going to do now?" she asked near the end of the meal. I told her I had spoken with Gareth Howell about the bearer bonds and the gold coins that had been in the ammunition can alongside the documents. They were as Jim had written in his letter, clean assets from earlier smaller transactions that predated his involvement with Greel's crew, saved and held for decades against exactly this kind of contingency. Combined, they represented a sum large enough to matter.
I was going to use them to establish a fund. Not named for Jim Callahan, he would have hated that. Named for the program at the Harlow Career and Technical Center, where he had learned his trade at 17, a program that no longer existed because the school's budget had been cut 4 years ago and the equipment sold. The fund would restore the program, pay for tools and instructors, and a properly equipped workshop where kids who were good with their hands and not particularly interested in 4-year colleges could learn something real.
It was, I told Fred what he would have done if he'd had the choice. The most direct, practical, quiet form of good he could imagine. She looked at me across the table. He would have liked that very much, she said. I know, I said. He told me. She raised an eyebrow. Not directly, I said, but he told me.
One afternoon in April, after the legal proceedings had reached the state of managed ongoing process that Gareth assured me required no immediate action from me, I went back down into the underground room for the last time. I brought the kerosene lantern and the box of matches from the shelf. I lit the lantern. I set my phone face down on the shelf so its light was not present. And I sat in the wooden chair, the one with the worn seat, the one where my father had sat alone in the cold for 22 years. And I let the lantern light move across the field stone walls the way it must have moved across them all those times when he was here. It was cold. The same profound, sealed cold. It smelled of earth and stone and time. I sat there for a long time. I thought about what it had cost him to sit in this chair, the specific texture of the fear, the monthly renewal of it when the payment went through, and he waited to see if this month would be the month something changed, if the quiet would hold, if his daughter would remain safe and unknowing in the house above. I thought about the Bible on the chair arm, worn soft, with handling its pages marked in margins I had read in the weeks since I found it. The passages he had returned to most were not the triumphant ones. They were the patient ones, the ones about endurance, about the value of continuing when continuing is the only option that preserves what matters. He had not been at peace down here, but he had been resolved. There is a difference. Peace is the absence of conflict. Resolution is the choice to continue despite it. My father had not been a peaceful man. He had been a resolved one, and that I understood now was considerably harder and considerably more admirable. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the iron key. I had carried it since the night I first found it. It had been in my pocket every day through the legal proceedings and the publication and the dissolution of the lien and the calls with Gareth and the lunch with Fred and all the ordinary and extraordinary days of the past weeks. It had been cold every time I touched it, the way it had been cold
the first time, as if it were simply the nature of the metal to hold the cold, regardless of the warmth around it. I held it in both hands for a moment. Then I set it on the shelf beside the spot where the ammunition can had sat. I set it down carefully, the way you set down something you have been carrying for a long time and are ready to stop carrying. I sat for a little while longer. Then I stood up. I picked up the lantern. I climbed the ladder, one rung at a time, back up through the square of light into the garage above. I set the lantern on the workbench. I took hold of the iron ring in the floor. I lowered the concrete door back into its frame, slowly, carefully, the way my father had clearly lowered it hundreds of times, guiding it, controlling its weight, not letting it drop. It settled into place with the sound of something fitting precisely where it belongs. I pulled the table saw back over it. The machine was heavy. My arms burned. The iron wheels left grooves in the concrete as they moved. It took the same 20 minutes it had taken to move it the first time. When it was back in position, you could not tell anything was different. The garage floor looked exactly as it always had. I stood back and looked at the room, the workbench, the pegboard with its organized tools, the wrenches in their descending order, the sockets in their labeled drawers. The maple slab 8 feet long and scarred with 30 years of work. On the surface, where I had left it 3 days ago, the unfinished birdhouse. Its joints perfectly cut the roof, weighting the structure sound, and precise in the way of everything Jim Callahan had ever built. I picked it up. I carried it out of the garage into the April morning. The Ohio light was the particular clean light of early spring, still cool the sky, an honest blue. The trees at the edge of the property just beginning to show green at the tips of their branches. I walked to the back corner of the yard, to the post I had set in the ground the previous weekend, a cedar post 8 feet tall with a platform mount at the top. I attached the birdhouse to the mount. It took a few minutes. The birdhouse was not quite finished. The roof was the piece I still needed to complete. But the structure was there, solid and true, and I had decided it was time to put it up regardless. I stepped back and looked at it against the morning sky. It wasn't perfect. The roof line wasn't quite right. I had added it myself, working from a book on Jim's shelf, and my cuts were close, but not what his would have been. The joints I'd made to attach the final pieces were good enough, but not seamless. It was the work of someone who had learned from watching and was doing it now for the first time on their own. He would have studied it carefully, the way he studied everything he built. He would have seen every imperfect angle, every place where the grain wasn't quite matched. And then he would have nodded. Not because it was what he could have done, because it was what I had done. Because done was not the enemy of good. Because a house with an imperfect roof is still a house. I stood in the yard and looked at the birdhouse on its post and at the house behind it. My house free and clear, the morning light on its old clapboard siding. and I felt something that took me a moment to identify because it was unfamiliar. Not the grief which was still there and would always be there. Not the cold, focused anger which had done its work and was quiet now. Something different. Something that belonged to the specific quality of this particular morning in this particular yard. It felt like ground, like standing on solid ground after a long time of standing on something uncertain. 4 days later, a pair of house wrens found the birdhouse. I was sitting on the back steps with coffee when they arrived, the male first landing on the platform and inspecting the entrance hole with the brisk efficiency of a creature that knows what it's looking for. Then the female a moment later, smaller and quieter. They went in and out several times. Then the male sat on the roof of the birdhouse and sang, not the fragment of song a bird makes when it's testing the air, but the full carrying, declarative song of a bird that has found what it was looking for. I sat on the steps and listened until he stopped. Then I went inside. I washed my coffee cup and set it on the rack. I opened the kitchen window to let in the morning air. I sat down at the table, my father's chair, the one with the slight list to the left, and I opened the notebook I had been writing in since the beginning of all this, and I wrote the date at the top of a new page. The house was quiet. The good kind of quiet now, not the silence of absence, but the silence of a place that has been lived in and will continue to be lived in. The silence of continuity. The kind of quiet that has a future in it. Outside, the wren had started singing again. I put my pen to the page. My father had given me 2 things. The first was a house. A physical structure of wood and concrete and old clapboard siding filled with the accumulated record of his life, and now increasingly of mine. A place that had been threatened and defended and returned. A place that was mine in the particular way that things become yours, not when they are given to you, but when you have had to fight to keep them. The second was harder to name. It was the thing he had left in the underground room alongside the documents and the cassette tapes and the 7-page letter. It was not in any of those things specifically. It was in the totality of them, in the understanding available only when you held all of it together of what kind of love builds a room underground and fills it carefully, and then waits 22 years for its daughter to find it. He never said, "I love you." He said it in every other possible way. In the fresh batteries in the cassette player, in the cross-referenced index, in the second envelope delivered to Gareth Howell, with instructions calibrated precisely to give me the freedom to choose. In the note on the piece of paper, garage, corner, forgive me. In the 3 copies in 3 locations with 3 people he had spent years quietly trusting. In the unfinished birdhouse left on the workbench for hands that were not his to finish, he said it in the only language he knew how to speak, and I had learned to read it. The wren outside sang on clear and persistent and entirely certain of itself into the clean Ohio morning. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds. The coffee maker ticked on the counter. The light moved across the floor the way it had moved across this floor every morning of my life. I wrote the date, and then I began.